Hello and welcome to the Fieldfisher Data Protection Get Fit series. My name is Lorna. I am a director in the Fieldfisher London data team, specializing in data protection, data privacy, and all issues surrounding data, personal or otherwise. And I'm delighted to be joined by one of our associates, Emma Yaltaghian, and our Solicitor-Apprentice, Kacey-Ann Keating. I am sure that there will be a number of our regular listeners tuning in to this latest installment of Data Protection Get Fit. For anyone new to our channel and series who has stumbled across this or perhaps been sent a link from a colleague, this is our third year of recording, and the objective of Data Protection Get Fit is to enhance your understanding of data protection and how it works in practice, and also just to perhaps take a deeper look at the guidance or a CJEU decision. So we're just wanting to get everybody up to speed and to a particular level of data protection awareness. So, as I mentioned, this is our third series of Data Protection Get Fit, and in fact it's the actual third session of the third series, and our focus today is data protection impact assessments, and we want to look at how to complete those documents and how you can maximize some of the benefits that come to fruition through completing a DPIA. Although, by way of reminder, it's not just about documenting. The document itself needs to work in practice. So, for example, when completing your DPIA and examining your mitigating steps, you need to be able to make workable proposals to alleviate any risks that you do consider maybe a potential, and you need to minimize these and ensure that any mitigating steps actually work in practice. And the DPIA itself needs to be evaluated and reviewed, and you need to also have a process in place that allows for that. And potentially, you may want to consider putting calendar alerts into team members' diaries so you know when a DPIA is up for review, a practical help to keep the compliance in order. And our learning objectives today, by the end of this session, we hope you'll be able to understand what DPIAs are and when they're required. Consider and know the different DPIA templates and what sector-specific DPIAs may be out there, or also you may have specific DPIAs for users such as children. Also, whether it's possible in certain circumstances to use a light touch DPIA or perhaps repurpose a comprehensive DPIA when you need to be able to leverage off something for another DPIA, but which has a lot of commonality from the initial DPIA. Also, we'll examine the consequences of not completing a DPIA when it's deemed necessary, and equally, it's a matter of ensuring that your DPIA is a living document that's reviewed and updated as necessary. We do have, as part of our first series of Data Protection Get Fit, a data protection impact assessment overview looking at what is required and the more theoretical basis of DPIAs. So let's take a look at what DPIAs are and when they need to be undertaken. Article 35 sets the foundations of when one is to be carried out. If there is systematic and extensive evaluation of an individual that's based on automated processing, including profiling, and on which decisions are made that produce legal effects, such as insurance premiums. Secondly, processing of a large scale amount of special category data, such as health. And thirdly, were the systematic monitoring of publicly accessible area, CCTVs in town centres, say. And then there are a number of blacklists produced by both the UK and other EU member states, which also list other areas where a DPIA will be needed. For example, in the UK, one is needed if you are processing children's data. So, in addition to Article 35 and the blacklists, there is also the EDPB's guidelines on DPIAs, and then the ICO has extensive guidance on data protection impact assessments, including a section on how do we do a DPIA. And if you haven't got the EDPB website and the ICO website bookmarked, I highly recommend you do, and cross-reference these sites and guidance not only when you're conducting your DPIA, but they are a continuously useful reference point. And I know that myself and a number, if not all of my colleagues do this regularly in practice, always cross-referencing to the guidelines and also fines which data protection authorities have imposed. And also, just looking at this headline here, Data Mapping Toolkit published by Japan Privacy Commission to help companies privacy assessments. This was a recent headline and just shows how there is a wealth of material out there for helping you complete your DPIA. So there are a number of different DPIA templates. The ICO has produced one. The CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, has even produced software for helping companies and organizations complete the data protection impact assessments. In the middle of the slide deck here is a copy of the ICO's risk assessment framework, and it's a very good way to consider the severity of impact with what you're doing against the likelihood of harm, and this will determine whether you're in a low, medium or high risk area. And what one of my colleagues, or maybe a collective, I'm sure, so I won't name the brilliance just in case I'm not crediting other members too, but what we have done with our DPIA based on the ICO template, but just made additions so that it incorporates the high risk framework and looks at, say, for example, the lawful basis of processing in a lot more granular detail, and then assesses the likelihood of harm, the severity, and the overall risk, and then an explanation for it. And besides those 6 categories you can see on the screenshot there, including data protection rights, we also look at elements of sensitive data, any profiling and automatic decision making, criminal convictions, the technical and organizational measures, data transfers, and direct marketing. So those real high impact areas, which are perhaps the most highest risk areas, and then also determine the risk of the processing. And as ever, it's the preparation which is key. And I think preparing for a DPIA is akin to preparing to bake a cake, in the sense that you'll clean your work surfaces, you'll get your ingredients ready, you'll consider your recipe, put the oven on to heat, and have your utensils and your cooling rack and everything in place. And you need to do that research and have all your tools together and information to assist when you're coming to complete your DPIA. And Emma will come on to discuss this in more detail, but be continuously thinking, even before you've started, to complete the DPIA document, how much information you can get yourself before that, before you start, because that will ultimately save resources and time in the long run.
It may seem as though there is only one way to conduct a DPIA, but that's not always the case, and it ultimately depends on the scenario. I will shortly take you through the more detailed DPIA process and what the common sticking points are. My colleague Kacey will then take you through the light touch DPIAs and when it may be more appropriate to effectively shorten the process. PIAs are privacy impact assessments, and this was a commonly used term pre-GDPR. Post-GDPR, the PIA process can be used where there is lower risk processing that doesn't warrant a full DPIA, but the organisation wants to maintain a record of its decision making and the factors that affected the decision, essentially demonstrating why the activity is lower risk. Recently, the ICO issued EasyLife with a £1.35 million fine for using the personal data of its customers to predict their medical condition and target them with health-related products. One key point in the ICO's decision was that EasyLife had failed to conduct a DPIA for this exercise and considered this a notable failing. This demonstrates that conducting a DPIA is an important part of privacy compliance that regulators will take into account if something does go wrong. You will most likely come across DPIAs in a long-form format, so that all privacy issues can be fully explored. The reason you'll work on long-form DPIAs rather than short-form is because long-form is suited to complex privacy issues that need to be resolved. Completing a DPIA may seem like a daunting task, as there are a lot of moving parts and a number of different teams to factor in. I'm going to speak to some of the more common sticking points or more difficult parts of completing a DPIA and provide some tips to help you navigate your way through the process. When preparing to conduct a DPIA, you need to do a lot of research first, as it's very important to get the facts clear. This can mean that before attempting to complete the form, research is undertaken in conjunction with other relevant teams in the business. It may be that you ask those teams to complete some of the factual questions relating to data flows and provide information about precisely what the product or service is intended to do. By pulling in other relevant teams, you will have a better chance of collating the correct information. Next up, we have legal basis. Identifying the correct legal basis can be a difficult task, which is why it's so important to have the correct facts in the first place. In order to make this analysis simpler, you may wish to split the processing up into distinct sections or phases and then work on the lawful basis for those specific phases. Often, it may seem as though multiple legal bases are appropriate, and if you are feeling stuck, it may help to discuss your approach with your DPO or Data Protection Compliance Manager. It may also be helpful to discuss this with your colleagues in other departments. For example, if you wish to rely on legitimate interests, it may be helpful to identify those precise legitimate interests with your colleagues to ensure that you are all aligned and that there's consistency across the business. Don't forget, if you're relying on legitimate interests, you will also need to complete a legitimate interest assessment. The next issue to discuss is mitigation and how best to put those in place. Identifying the appropriate mitigations will depend on how the risks have been captured and identified in the top part of the form. The mitigations for each risk will likely be different, and again, it's key to engage with other stakeholders in this process so that you can determine what mitigations can reasonably be implemented in the business. Once you have a draft list of mitigations, consult with those other teams before finalising them so you can ensure that they're practical. If you can't mitigate the associated risks, you will need to discuss this with your local supervisory authority or lead authority if you have appointed one. Finally, we have timing. You will need to start on the DPIA several months in advance of the rollout of the product or service. Remember, if you conduct a DPIA after the product or service has been rolled out, it can be very difficult to go back and remediate issues whilst the product or service is live.
So let's now take a look at what sector-specific support is out there when you're looking at a DPIA, and whether that's maybe health or financial services, retail, technology. There is a lot of commentary and support about the DPIAs, and looking at what regulations may also be necessary to take into account. So say, for example, I appreciate Emma will be talking about the Age Appropriate Design Code, DPIA, shortly, but there you do need to be taking into account all different research about children and their health and well-being. So it may be that there are wider concerns when you do your own DPIA on a specific sector or user group. Interestingly, when the NHS and then the government was also doing its track and trace apps during the height of the COVID pandemic, there was a number of different DPIAs released, and wanting to provide user trust, and I think DPIAs are very good for doing that. And I think with health data, you need to be supporting user trust, because it can be a very intrusive collection of data, and yet the benefits of health research are enormous. So what the DPIA can do is to help allay any fears with respect to the personal data collection, and then look at the wider benefits and equally assure users that there'll be no mission creep. Similarly, the UK's Health Research Authority has, with the ICO and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, created some expectations around DPIAs. And then it may be, in addition to the DPIA itself and a sector-specific DPIA, there are other considerations. For example, ethics here we see at the University of Barcelona. So the UNESCO Chair of Bioethics of the University of Barcelona have developed a methodology, an agile toolkit to carry out a DPIA in health. And I think that's very interesting and exciting that it is an agile tool, so can be developed and used according to your own project. And I think knowing that it's agile also shows it's not just a laborious exercise of the DPIA, and also it's so multidimensional that there are benefits that come out of it. Sometimes when completing a DPIA, it's akin to doing a data audit of your systems and your compliance. And so things will be flushed out and questioned when you're doing your DPIA, and you also need to be considerate of those, and also know that have those expectations that you will come across new things and perhaps unexpected things that you'll have to respond to. And also there'll be a lot of collaboration and communication across departments.
The Children's Code contains 15 standards that online services need to follow, and it was developed by the ICO. These 15 standards ensures that organisations are complying with their obligations under data protection law to protect children's data online. Online services covered by the code are wide-ranging and may include apps, games, connected toys and devices, as well as news services. If children are likely to access your service, even if they're not your target audience, then you will need to consider the Children's Code. In order to help organisations comply with the Children's Code, the ICO helpfully provides a template DPIA. If you use this DPIA, you may wish to add in the 15 standards of the code so that you can continue to reflect on those standards and ensure that they are represented throughout the privacy process. When conducting a DPIA in accordance with the Children's Code, be sure to define the user journey and consider all aspects of it so that privacy mitigations can be built in throughout. You will need to consider the various ways that children may access and use your service, as it may not always be straightforward. It is also important to consider how children's data may be shared both internally and externally, bearing in mind that this fact will also need to be explained to children in a privacy notice. The risks of sharing children's data are greater, and therefore further consideration should be applied to the initial question of, should we share this personal data in the first place? Working through the DPIA process, bearing in mind the 15 standards, will help you to identify who the relevant stakeholders are that you will need to share that data with, and it may also help you to identify those partners in the process that perhaps don't need that data.
Let's now take a look at when a light touch DPIA is appropriate. Firstly, if you have any doubt, then the best practice is to undertake a DPIA. However, a quick, light touch skeleton framework may help you make a more informed decision. The particular focus areas will be the data being processed, the volume of data, the purposes of processing, and data transfers. If you are ticking all of these boxes, then it is likely a full DPIA would be required. However, if you're not ticking all of these areas, then this might be the stage when you look at the potential risks that would be more evident of whether you need to carry one out. It will only be appropriate at the outset to determine whether a full DPIA is needed, such as by carrying out a privacy impact assessment, which was common practice pre-GDPR, for low-level processing where there is minimal risk. Whereas light touch DPIAs should only be carried out where there is minimal risk, a full DPIA is required where the type of processing is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. To assess whether something is high risk, the UK GDPR is clear that you need to consider both the likelihood and severity of any potential harm to individuals. Risk implies a more than remote chance of some harm. High risk implies a higher threshold, either because the harm is more likely or because the potential harm is more severe, or a combination of the two. Assessing the likelihood of risk in that sense is crucial in determining whether a light touch or full DPIA is appropriate. If there is any doubt about whether a processing activity does trigger the requirement to undertake a DPIA, the best practice is to undertake one. The EDPB and ICO are both clear on this recommendation. A light touch DPIA could include a privacy review, which could be documented, for example, by way of just an email exchange, highlighting any risks and required mitigations, but without completing the full DPIA form or process. Do remember that you still need to retain these email exchanges with your data processing records. We're now going to compare a snippet of a light DPIA to a full DPIA. So on the left-hand side, we can see an example of some questions asked in a light DPIA we've previously prepared. On the right is some questions from a full DPIA. As you can see, the questions in the light touch are a lot broader, requiring less details, and in some cases, just single selection answers. As mentioned previously, a full DPIA is required where a type of processing is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. As we can see in the example on the right, the questions are more in-depth and require further details. A full DPIA will require extensive details on any high-risk processing that will be undertaken, such as any profiling and any automated decision-making. For example, assessing your processing against the high-risk framework which was displayed earlier. As well as the questions asked, the answers are typically a lot more detailed and in-depth compared to those provided in a light touch DPIA. A full DPIA will help you to evidence that you have considered the risks related to your intended processing and that you have met your broader data protection obligations. As mentioned earlier, there may be some circumstances where a light touch DPIA is appropriate due to the fact that supporting documents have been reviewed and considered previously. Recently, we were able to provide a light touch DPIA to a client whose processing of data was still high risk, but due to the work completed on the matter beforehand, it was concluded that a full DPIA was not necessary. The reason you could do a light DPIA is because you've done a global data protection review and have reviewed and considered all of the supporting and accompanying documentation. The task in hand was to consider whether you could process data taken from an employee's mobile device in a corporate environment. Clearly, taking this data is extremely intrusive, and it was important to know the impact of this and whether it was considered high risk. The data controller needed to be able to explain the lengths it had gone to and the various processes in place. This was determined by looking through a communications technology use policy. As well as this policy, we also looked at the BYOD policy and privacy notice and the different processing activities. As there was substantial background information that could be applied and cross-referenced to the DPIA, it was concluded that this information did not need to be repeated in a comprehensive DPIA.
Sometimes the resources are not always there to continually go through the labour-intensive process of conducting a DPIA. If a DPIA for a similar product or service has already been conducted, it may well be possible to leverage the good work already done and repurpose that DPIA. If you're going to repurpose it, you will need to spend some time comparing the products or services and identifying whether there are enough common themes to leverage that DPIA. If you think there are, you will then also need to go on to identify the key differentiators so that it's clear why a separate DPIA needs to be produced. Also consider whether the technology or industry standard has since moved on since the last DPIA was conducted. For example, a DPIA related to employee monitoring software may look very different if it was drafted in 2019 compared to 2021, given the rise in home working. Another factor to think about is whether anything can generally be improved, for example, new industry guidelines or viewpoints to incorporate. In particular, consider the applicable mitigating factors for each DPIA. If there is enough reason to create a new DPIA, then there will be enough reason to identify different mitigating measures.
Well, thank you, Emma and Kacey-Ann, for those points, which has been very interesting to hear. And also, I think what it shows is how broad the considerations around data protection impact assessments can be. And I think very much to highlight is the point Emma made when you're revisiting your DPIA and monitoring it periodically to think about what's happened in the market and perhaps has the technology changed, have new regulations come out, has there been a decision which perhaps impacts on how you're processing and things that you may want to do differently. So let's just recap and provide you with your key takeaways. So it's useful to consider what your organization's DPIA process is, whether a checklist would be beneficial, but know what your starting point is. Also, what can you do with the information you've already got? So can a DPIA be repurposed? And equally, where you've done a lot of work preparatory already, can you leverage from that and produce a light DPIA? Equally, is there need to have a full DPIA, and will a light DPIA suffice? So thinking about what's best for your business and what is most appropriate. Similarly, which template works best for you, and are you going to have some software that helps you pre-populate and automate some of your DPIAs? Are there any sector demands for additional provisions within the DPIA? And what methodology are you going to use? And how can you factor in that risk matrix from the ICO, which is a very good useful source to implement and also to get you thinking about what the risks are and whether something that may seem like a high risk may not be so high if it's not going to be overly using too many people. So, you could have one or two it would be relevant to as opposed to hundreds and thousands. So sometimes it's a matter of looking at things on a case by case basis. And overall, we must always remember the document is not for filing. Naturally, you will want to have a good filing system electronically, but equally you need to have that review mechanism in place and be able to adapt your DPIA. They are without a doubt intensive documents, but they will allow you to invest your time well, and also invest the time and resources well of the business in keeping with its data protection compliance policies. So, you know, it does kill many birds with one stone. Apologies to anyone who takes offense, just meaning that metaphorically, but it's more than a two birds with one stone analogy, because as I mentioned, it is like conducting at times a data protection audit. So for those who may want to listen to more and see what's upcoming in the series, we will go to the next slide. So Fieldfisher itself has a wealth of material. There is the data protection YouTube team channel. There's also our blog and insights post, and on the YouTube team channel we do have the Data Protection Get Fit, which covers the fundamentals of data protection law. Then there's some intermediate bite-sized sessions which focus on specifics of data protection. We've also done a subscribers Q&A where we asked for questions, and we have some individual webinars and mini series delivered by the team as well. So plenty of material for you to focus in on. And if you're new to data protection, what I suggest is you kind of select a topic of interest for you that that you can bring alive and look at. And if you're looking at, say for example, DPIAs, you can consider this channel, and then also look at our other DPIA material and search also our internet site for our topics on DPIAs and content on DPIAs as well. Also looking at the ICO guidance and the EDPB guidelines too. Then, as you're aware, if this is the details for our YouTube channel, and then also on our internet site you will be able to sign up to read our regular emails and the periodical publications that we do, and you can select across all the services and departments that Fieldfisher offers, not just data and privacy, but across our fully service range of law specialisms. Well, I'd just like to thank you for joining us and to share with you our contact details. We are all on LinkedIn, so please do link in with us and contact us directly at Fieldfisher if you have any questions or you'd like to hear about any specific topics, and we will hope to bring those to you in the future. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.